Yeah, I think former President Rodrigo Duterte, put it best when he described Japan as, as close as a brother, right? Because Japan is the only major power in the region that has managed to maintain really robust relationship with all contemporary Filipino presidents, right? So President Aquino, I think, had half a dozen visits to Japan. He had a major visit to Japan in 2015 when he made a big speech in the Japanese Diet. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was the first foreign leader to visit the Philippines under President Duterte. He visited Davao. Absolutely good relationship with also Japan under President Duterte. And of course, under President Marcos, we expect that to continue because if you look at it, yes, it's true that Japan is not number one for us in all indicators in recent years. But if you look at the past 20, 30 years, Japan is by far our most important economic partner. And pagdating sa infrastructure development, no less than Secretary Jokno, who has been in charge of budget, who has been in charge of central bank, who has been in charge of finance. Aminado siya that Japan has been the really number one source of foreign financing for our infrastructure development in recent years. But what makes Japan even more important in the past 5 or 6 years or so is that they're also becoming our security partner. Tinutulungan tayo dun sa Philippine Coast Guard by giving us multi-role vessels. They're giving us surveillance aircrafts. They're going to give us new radar systems built by Mitsubishi. And last year, we had our first 2+2 defense and foreign ministers meeting with Japan, which means we want to push our defense relationship with Japan to at least the level of Australia, if not higher, because Australia has the status forces visiting forces agreement with us. That's something that we're going to work on. So yun ang watch natin, not to mention yung tinatawag na Reciprocal Access Agreement, which will allow the Japanese to have more easy access to Philippine facilities and more interoperability among our forces. So Japan is perhaps the most comprehensive partner that the Philippines has because US is a big security partner, but economically speaking, Japan is by far ahead of all of our traditional partners.
Well, you talked about helping the economy, talked about loans, and now you're talking about being a security partner. What do you think would be the most important take-home of President Marcos after this bilateral trip?
Yeah, so for sure, we're going to look at investment pledges. I don't think na maging kasing laki siya ng mga 20 billion, 24 billion pledges that comes from China. Maybe we're going to talk about a few $billion here. The initial estimates we're seeing are $3, $4, $5 billion. But we know with the Japanese, when they make a pledge, that money is going to come sooner than later, or sometimes later than sooner. And it's going to be quality investments. And it's going to be an investment that is not going to create jobs just for the donor country. It's going to create jobs for the locals. Because the problem we always have with the Chinese investments is that they tend to create a lot of jobs for Chinese workers, Chinese engineers, Chinese companies. But with the Japanese investments, it creates a lot of jobs domestically because they rely on domestic workers, domestic management even sometimes, and hopefully also technology transfer. So nakikita natin sa sector ng infrastructure, agriculture, we're going to see a lot of investments from Japan, also in the retail sector. But hopefully we're also going to look at big defense deals, including a reciprocal access agreement and perhaps even discussion of a status of forces agreement with Japan in the coming years or so. Yes, medyo political sensitive ito sa Japan at sa Pilipinas. But I think as tensions get higher between US and China, as the Philippines pivots more towards the United States and becomes more important to Taiwan, the Philippines is also becoming much more important to Japan. And I think President Marcos doesn't want to be too dependent on US alone, so he would want to diversify, and that's where Japan is a perfect partner for the Philippines. So in short, I think this is the most important foreign visit of President Marcos yet. Nakailan na siya? 9 in 7 months? I would say out of the 9 that he did, this is going to be the most important yet.
Richard, we always, of course, talk about why this is important for the Philippines. Let me take a new tack here and just really isolate Japan for Japan's sake. To add context here, what are the national interests of Japan here right now for itself? You talked about its economic power. They've been overtaken by China over the last 3 decades. Military-wise, we're looking at what's happening to Germany. Suddenly, given the new world order, looking at more spending in defense. We know that Japan has been constrained in that area as well. We also know Japan, even without the West Philippine Sea, has its own issues with territory with China. Take everybody out, even the Philippines. What's in this for Japan and for not just the Philippines, but everything that Japan is trying to position on?
Yeah, Japan is in a historic moment. Japan is coming back, no? So for 67 years, Japan has been constrained from becoming a normal power dahil sa Article 9 ng kanilang pacifist constitution, which prevents them from offensive military projection of power. But we saw under Prime Minister Shinzo Abe over the past decade, this was very much relaxed. They came out with ways to go around it. And now the ruling coalition may have enough numbers to even push for the revision of the constitution. But even short of that, just last December, Japan announced that they're going to double their defense spending from 1% of the GDP to 2%. We're talking about $300 billion in additional defense spending over the next 5 years. And yes, Japan is no longer number 1 in Asia and number 2 in the world, but it's still number 3 in the world and number 2 in Asia. So they're not some pipsqueak, right? They're still a major economic force. And speaking of economics, it's the biggest infrastructure investor in Southeast Asia by far. And China gets a lot of bang out of imaginary buck. The Japanese don't talk as much, don't promote themselves as much. They're not as good in public diplomacy perhaps as the Chinese, but they're doing a lot of investment in Vietnam, in Philippines, in Indonesia, and across the region. And security-wise, of course, Japan is worried about what's going to happen in Taiwan. It's worried about China's expansion in the region. And by the way, Japan is also worried if the U.S. will stick around once they elect another Trump or Trump himself again in the near future. So Japan is looking at a more independent, more self-reliant foreign policy and defense policy. And it looks around, and in Southeast Asia, Philippines is perhaps the most natural partner it can see. And a little bit down under, of course, there's Australia. So that's also that's the bigger Indo-Pacific picture we're looking at. And not to mention, in terms of investments, Japan wants to go beyond China, but also beyond Vietnam. So Philippines is in the China +1, Vietnam +1 strategy of Japan too, when it comes to manufacturing and other kind of quality investments. So that's why mahalaga din tayo sa Japan. And as I said, don't count Japan out yet. Despite all the stagnation and all, they're the 3rd largest economy in the world, and they have the most advanced armed forces in Asia.